This portion tackles the possible outcomes of interspecific competition. Previously, it was presented that there are two graphs for the Lotka-Volterra model of competition. These two graphs illustrate what happens to a population when it is below or above its isocline. However, these graphs only account for one isocline at a time, and thus interpreting the combined dynamics of the two competing species would be impossible. As a solution, their isoclines must be drawn on the same graph. And there are only four qualitatively different ways in which to plot the isoclines. These four graphs include both species isoclines and illustrate the possible outcomes of interspecific competition depending on where each species isocline lies in relation to the other. In each graph, the solid green line represents the isocline of species 1 and the solid yellow line represents the isocline of species 2. The colored arrows indicate the trajectories of the individual populations, and the black arrow represents the joint trajectory of the two populations. So for the first scenario, the isocline for species 1 is above and to the right of the isocline for species 2. And as you can see, there are three regions, A, B, and C. In region A, both populations are below the respective isoclines, and as a result, both will increase in population as indicated by the arrows. On the other hand, for any point in region B, both will decrease in population as they are above the respective isoclines. Now, for any point in region C, species 1 is still below its isocline, so its population increases. But species 2 is above its isocline, so its population is decreasing. The joint movement of the two populations is down and to the right, so species 1 increases until it reaches carrying capacity K1, and species 2 is driven to extinction. In this scenario, species 1 always outcompetes species 2. The second scenario is the opposite of the first. Now, the isocline for species 2 is above and to the right of the isocline for species 1. This graph can be interpreted in much the same way as the previous one, except that the joint trajectory of the two populations is up and to the left. In this case, species 2 always outcompetes species 1. So in the third scenario, we can see that the isoclines cross one another. We can see that there are now four regions, A, B, C, and D. Also in this case, we can see that the carrying capacity of both species are lower than others' carrying capacity divided by competition coefficient. Now for the interpretation, in regions A and B, this is the same as the first two scenarios. In region A, both population size will increase, and in region B, the populations will decrease. However, in regions C and D, where the populations of the two species are between the isoclines, their joint trajectories are always heading towards the intersection point E. And it simply means that the two species can coexist at this stable equilibrium point. In the fourth scenario, the isoclines of the two species also cross one another. However, unlike in the third scenario, both species carrying capacity is now higher than the other's carrying capacity divided by the competition coefficient. In interpreting the graph, again, in region A, both populations will increase in size. In region B, both populations will decrease in size. Now in region C, the joint trajectory is similar in the first scenario. Thus, the outcome is just the same, which is the competitive exclusion of species 2 by species 1. On the other hand, in region D, the joint trajectory is similar in the second scenario. So it will also result in the competitive exclusion of species 1 by species 2. In this scenario, however, predicting who will outcompete the other population is difficult. The outcome depends on the initial abundances of the two species. but frequently, the more abundant species wins. In sum, there are four possible outcomes of interspecific competition, which were represented by the four graphs. First, species 1 inhibits species 2, leading the extinction of species 2. Second, species 2 inhibits species 1, leading the extinction of species 1. Third, individuals inhibit their own species more than the other, and as a result, they coexist. Lastly, individuals of both species inhibit the other species more than their own species, and frequently, the most abundant one eventually wins. Now let's take a look at some PARAMECIA lab experiments. So for the first example, the competition between Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum were investigated. They were first grown separately and then together in a tube containing a fixed amount of bacterial food. Separately, both species thrive. However, when grown together, the population of P. caudatum declined, as you can see here. So we can say that the population of P. aurelia drove the population of P. caudatum to die out. In another experiment, populations of Paramecium caudatum were examined with another species, the Paramecium bursaria. However, in this case, unlike in the previous experiment, when grown together, the populations of the two species thrive. It was found that these two coexisted because Paramecium caudatum feed on bacteria suspended in solution, whereas Paramecium bursaria restricted its feeding at the bottom of the tubes. Basically, there is a resource partitioning. Each species used food unavailable to the other. Next is a lab experiment done on flower beetles. In this experiment, these two species of flower beetles were first grown in a hot-wet environment separately, and both thrive as you can see in this graph. However, when the species were grown together in the same condition, hot-wet, although it took more than a year where several generations have passed, trivolium confusion eventually died off. And it was found that Tribolium castaneum won over Tribolium confusum because they were the first to establish more abundance in the given environment. Basically, these lab experiments support the Lotka-Volterra model. Scenario 1 and Scenario 2 is supported with the Paramecia Experiment 1, where a Paramecium species inhibits other Paramecium species, leading to the extinction of the other. Scenario 3 is supported by the flower beetle experiments, where populations of two flower beetles were grown together, but the outcome was not completely predictable. The species who became more abundant first eventually outcompeted the other species. Scenario 4 is supported by the Paramecia Experiment 2, where populations of the two Paramecium species were grown together and coexist due to resource partitioning.